Thank you for a spectacular lecture and for inviting me to participate in this discussion. The research on reading, I think, is so spectacularly interesting and also important, as the two previous discussants emphasize, important for us to understand our culture and these enormous societal issues. Compared to that, I feel that my remarks might sound slightly blasphemous because I think partly for me what's so interesting about reading is it's an example of the feat of learning, that we can take something so abstract and conceptual and difficult, if we've watched children learn how to read, and yet turn it into something very natural and so automatic that, in fact, one of the most common phenomena in cognitive psychology is that people have difficulty suppressing it. And this transformation of something difficult, conceptual, meaningful, and elaborate into something automatic and something we can't suppress, I think really gives us a window into what learning does for us all the time. And so I'd like to just share my perspective in that sense on reading really as a window into how the brain learns. And really, learning happens not just in the classroom when we're learning how to do math or how to read. Learning happens all the time, every day. It is what supports our ability to stand here and give lectures, to turn off our phones, and to get up and leave when we need to conduct social relations. The overall question of how the brain accomplishes learning, how we sort of train up these specialized systems in our brain across these many different domains, has led to the discovery of the suggestion of the idea that the brain has multiple specialized learning systems, that not just do we have these sort of domain-specific regions of the brain for words, for language, for faces, for houses, but that the plasticity in those regions, the structural changes that accompany learning, are trained up by more domain-general neural mechanisms that apply to many different kinds of learning, but in different ways. And so two relatively well-researched brain systems that we've been interested in and that I kept on thinking about in terms of their possible role in early learning and late learning and how those roles may differ are the striatum and the hippocampus. So as many of you know, there's research going back to the 1950s discovering that damage to the hippocampus, as happened famously with patient HM, renders people unable to form new memories for particular moments in time. So patient HM underwent surgical removal bilaterally of the hippocampus and was able to learn many kinds of skills and habits, but was unable to form long-term memories of individual moments in time, things as simple as who was the doctor who I saw this morning. That led to the idea that what the hippocampus does is help us form what most of us colloquially refer to really as memories of moments in time, of episodes of our lives. But just as important as the discovery that the hippocampus supports this form of memory that is essential possibly for early learning about reading and language, was a discovery that more automatic forms of learning don't depend on the hippocampus at all, that they're kind of trained up by a separate system. And one of the key systems for that sort of learning is the striatum. So we now know that the striatum is essential for learning of skills, motor skills, cognitive skills, and many people like to think of this as a brain system that's sort of specialized for forming habits, for linking cues to actions, to motor responses. So this is a very useful way of thinking about the world, and I think it really applies broadly to much of the data out there. But as often happens in science, I think really where this story starts being particularly interesting is in its failures to account for many aspects of the data that have kind of been ignored, and that's something that's kept us busy in my lab for the last 10 years or so. And in particular, what we're finding, which I think might be particularly relevant here, is that the hippocampus is important not just for these moments in time, but that it influences many behaviors that appear to be well-learned skills. So many behaviors that appear to be automatic, that we don't really think about very much, actually involve the hippocampus more than one would have expected. And in a particular way, as if it's sort of all our skills, in many cases, actually sort of turn to the hippocampus for more information about what to do when the situations are complicated. Let me give you an example for that. first, this arrow is to remind me to make sure to tell you that not just that the hippocampus is influencing the striatum, but that in general these systems are far more interactive than was initially appreciated. And I think the kind of loose but useful summary of a lot of the recent work is that really we can think of memory as an internal representation, and that those kinds of internal representations are important for many aspects of behavior. And in that sense, that memory of the form we think the hippocampus supports underlies things like prospection, not just retrieving memories, but thinking about the future in detail, deliberation, and really sort of, compelling to want to think of this as the basis of many aspects of thought. And that this sort of complex contribution of the hippocampus is important even for seemingly simple behaviors. And so I want to show you a quick example of a behavior that I think our undergraduates are probably as much experts at as they are probably at reading, which is choosing between two snack items. So we ask our undergraduates in our lab to choose between two snack items, and they can do this readily, and they really enjoy doing this. We give them some of the snacks for real. And this is the sort of thing that seems very automatic, right? There really is no need to deliberate or think. I guess you have to read. Probably you don't really have to read even to make this sort of choice. And so this is, I should say, this is a study in collaboration with Mike Shadlin, being led by a joint postdoc, Akram Bakour. And what we're finding is that these sorts of decisions, perhaps somewhat surprisingly, involve activity in the hippocampus, shown here. But it's not all these decisions that involve the hippocampus, and it's not all these decisions that depend on the hippocampus. It's these decisions about highly familiar items when those familiar items are of similar value to you. So if you now have to make a choice that seems automatic in the sense of familiarity of the things you're choosing about, but that choice is not easy, it involves some thought or deliberation, it takes you a little bit longer to make this sort of choice, that's when we're seeing that the hippocampus is contributing. And so we're seeing that activity in the hippocampus correlates with the difficulty of the decisions and with how long it takes you to make those kinds of decisions. And so this had me thinking about whether people might use memory and these sort of hippocampal deliberative mechanisms to resolve ambiguity in reading. And I just noticed the other day my daughter, who reads often and frequently, got stuck on a word because it was a word that was similar to something we were discussing earlier. And it made me think about all the many ways in which the associations that come to mind in memory are changing the way we read and maybe even affecting our fluency. I am going to skip over this, but just will tell you why I wanted to include this rather than show it to you, which is I think that considering the role of memory in the hippocampus in many seemingly automatic behaviors and considering the relationship between the striatum and the hippocampus in that sense is also important because we now know that that balance between these two systems really changes over the course of development. And what we've found, reported recently, is the somewhat surprising result that the hippocampus is contributing to seemingly automatic behaviors much more so in adolescents than in adults, and more so in adolescents than in children. So it would appear that it is during that special phase of adolescence that this kind of richer, more associative memory mechanism is coming online, even when it doesn't seem to be needed, but it's providing extra sort of information during adolescent years, and that is related to how teenagers learn. So I will just end then with the question of whether considering these interactions between learning systems and how they change with development might affect reading even beyond the years of establishing the skill into how reading is used in later phases of life. Thank you.